should you be feeding your dairy goats? Today, we're diving into this all important question, and we're going to be tackling the topics of what to feed your dairy goats, how much to feed, how to tell that they're getting enough, what kinds of hay and browse and grain are going to be best for them, and how to make the best feeding choices for your goats. If we haven't met before, hi, I'm Sarah from the Nest in the West. I live on a 2-acre homestead in the West Valley of Phoenix, Arizona with my family. I'm a homeschool mom to 4. I raise mini Nubian dairy goats. I'm a small-scale flower farmer, and I teach homesteaders the art of goat milk cheese making, as well as holistic dairy goat care inside my online courses and membership. Okay, so how to feed your goats and what to feed them is a pretty hot topic in the goat world. And honestly, people feel really strongly about these things, or you'll find that when you ask a few different people, you'll get all kinds of often conflicting advice on this topic. The reality is it's really not that complicated to feed goats. You just have to know how their bodies work and make sure you're meeting their metabolic needs. Now, goats are rather unique among ruminants. They are not grazers like sheep and cattle, although they do graze. They're actually browsers, a little more akin to deer and elk. And so while they do eat grass and it's an important part of their diet, they also require things like shrubs and weeds and tree branches and tree fodder to help make sure they're getting a really balanced diet. I remember the first time I walked into a Tractor Supply looking for food for my very new dairy goats and realized that all of the bags labeled goat feed were really just some form of sweet feed. And I felt really confused wandering the feed aisles thinking, what else do I need to give my goat in addition to this bag that just says goat feed on it? Now, we'll talk more about grain and whether or not you should be giving your goats grain in a few minutes. But right off the bat, it's good to know that the primary source of nutrition for your goats is going to be roughage, such as hay, alfalfa, or browse of some kind. So let's talk more about goats being ruminants. They have a 4-chamber stomach, just like a cow, and their bodies are designed as fermentation vats. They are designed to take fibrous material and ferment it and turn it into protein in the form of meat and milk. It's really incredible, and the design of dairy goats always is just so astonishing to me, and it's really neat what they can do simply with grass and forage. Now, as their body moves their forage through the multi-chambers of their stomach, they're going to regurgitate some of that food and chew it again, and then it passes into a different chamber. So that's what we refer to as chewing cud, and it's a really good sign of health in your ruminant animal. So because this feed is fermenting inside their multi-chambered stomach, it's important to remember that there is a symphony of bacteria living inside their rumen, and it's really important that we're feeding the microbes that are doing all that heavy lifting in there and not just the animal itself. So making sure that your goats have a good balance of roughage and grass and browse compared to other feeds in their diet is really important. So before you ever worry about what sort of grain to give or how much, first and foremost, you need to be focusing on what kind of browse do they have available to them. Here on our farm, we feed alfalfa hay to our goats. And if you've ever heard anyone say that alfalfa is too rich for goats, you're probably not talking about the same kind of animal. They're probably referring to pet goats or meat goats of some kind, and not dairy goats. Dairy goats and pet goats are completely different beasts. Dairy goats are not your basic minivan. They're not your basic pickup truck. They are a fancy schmancy vehicle, and they need top quality stuff. Alfalfa is actually a really important part of a dairy goat's diet because it has high calcium and high protein, both of which really support a doe during her lactation. You don't have to feed this as hay necessarily. You could feed alfalfa as pellets as well. Hay is just a good option where we live. It's grown locally here. And so while there are pellets in my mixed grain ration I give my dairy does too when they're in milk, primarily what we are feeding them is alfalfa hay. Now, if your goats live on a dry lot, they are going to need grass hay as well for that roughage. However, my goats are on about an acre of pasture, and so they get plenty of grass from the pasture. When you're talking about different kinds of hay that is acceptable to feed goats, though, there's all kinds of great ones out there. Orchard grass is really good for goats, so is Timothy hay. Bermuda is pretty popular where I live, and it's mostly Bermuda grass that's in my pasture, actually. So if my goats were not on pasture, we'd be feeding them some Bermuda hay in addition to their alfalfa. Now, my herd is a mixed herd of does and wethers, that's castrated male goats. So my bucks live in a dry lot and they get a different sort of feed. Alfalfa is a rather rich hay for my bucks, and so we feed them a pretty simple diet of just Bermuda hay. And they also get access to minerals and fresh water and all that good stuff too. Now, generally speaking, goats need to consume about 4 to 5% of their body weight in roughage every day. And that's going to go up a little bit if they're eating fresh things like grass or fodder from trees or other plants versus dry hay. But that gets a little messy to calculate exactly how much each goat needs. And especially if you're dealing with a herd, it's a lot easier to just feed free choice hay and start there. Always make sure that your goats have hay available. If they're leaving some of it behind, stems, or the bits that they just aren't interested in, don't try and starve them into eating that. Chances are it's probably not high enough quality, and so they are discarding it, and starving them is not going to make any bit of difference. This is where it really helps to keep a mixed herd. We eliminate a lot of hay waste on our farm by keeping does and wethers together. We castrate bucklings to raise them as wethers for meat each year, and so they get to live with their moms and sisters on pasture. And the beauty of keeping wethers together with their moms and sisters is that the does, like I said before, they are the high quality, the Porsches of the goat world. And so they have higher nutritional needs. They're going to be a little pickier about what they're eating, but the wethers really don't care. And so they will eat a lot of the stems and unchoiced bits that the does would otherwise leave behind. Now, like I mentioned before, because goats are browsers and not just grazers, if they are in a dry lot, it's really great to bring them bits of forage as often as you can. So you can bring them tree trimmings or garden scraps. Just make sure that whatever you're feeding is unsprayed and safe for goats to eat. So don't give things like tomato plants. Tomatoes themselves are a perfectly fine snack for goats, but not tomato plants or other nightshades like potato plants. Generally speaking, goats are pretty good about knowing what sorts of things they can eat and what they can't, but I still don't recommend intentionally feeding them poisonous plants. Goats are great for eating poison ivy or overgrown blackberries or other brambly, thorny sorts of plants you might have on your property. They're great for clearing undergrowth around your woods. So whenever you have the opportunity to run your goats in an area where they have a lot of forage to eat from and weeds and broadleaf plants or brambles, those are so good for them. And not only are they getting great quality nutrition from those things, chances are high they're also going to be getting rid of a lot of problem plants on your property. Okay, so let's take a second to talk about hay quality. Now, dairy goats do require the higher quality hay that you can buy. So make sure when you are purchasing hay that whoever you're buying it from doesn't hear the word goat and think, oh, low quality, kind of like, cow quality hay. You want the good stuff. And so I always try to buy number 1 or number 2 alfalfa. And if you're not sure how to describe the quality you need, you can just say you need horse hay and that'll put you in the right direction. All right, moving right along. Do dairy goats need grain? Short answer, yes. There's no such thing as a grass-fed dairy goat. I mean, you can feed them just grass with no grain, and maybe some smaller breeds that don't produce a high quantity of milk can get away without grain. But generally speaking, if you have a dairy goat, they have been bred over many years to produce a whole lot more milk than just their babies can take. And they need a lot of support to be able to do that. Whether or not you're giving them their groceries, their body's going to continue to produce high volume of milk and just sap what they need from the goat's body, and that quickly deteriorates their bodies and leads to a mess of a situation. So yes, goats do need grain if they are a good producing milk animal. Now, when you're looking for a good grain to give your goats, generally speaking, most of the pelleted grains out there that say they're for goats are not going to be a super high quality. They're usually full of corn and soy byproducts. They're usually more of a glorified sweet feed, maybe with some synthetic vitamins mixed in. And so on the whole, I tend not to recommend things like that for dairy goats. Here on our farm, we're able to source a really great quality dairy goat grain ration from a farm up in Montana. There are no local grain mills around me, and so together with a group of a lot of homesteaders in the area that we live, we have a buying co-op, and so every 2 months we're bringing in another couple pallets of grain, and everyone pitches in to be able to make it worth it for everyone. But if you don't have an option like a grain mill nearby or some sort of buying co-op where you can bring in a higher quality feed than what's local to you, you can totally mix your own. Azure Standard sells a lot of bulk grains, and so it is quite possible to mix your very own dairy grain ration. And I actually have a good recipe that's based on the one that I buy. It's a free resource, and if you just check for the link in the description, you'll be able to find it there. Generally speaking, I'm feeding about 1 to 2 pounds of grain per day to my dairy goats, depending on how much milk they're producing and their body condition and what they need. There's really no one size fits all with goats, unfortunately. Some goats are easier keepers than others. Some tend to produce a whole lot of milk and do it without breaking a sweat. Some of them need a lot more support. I always recommend starting by giving a little more than what you think that they need, and then pulling back gradually as needed, because especially for does and milk, it's really hard to get them back on track once they've lost some weight. And it's important to be able to support their metabolism at every stage of their lactation when they're performing such a huge task of providing all of that milk for you. Something we like to do on our farm that helps make the grain go a little bit further and just break down easier and be more nutritionally available to our does is soak it with some water and then add a bit of apple cider vinegar or yogurt whey or clabber or whatever other ferment I've got going on, and just mix it in with their feed. And that not only slows them down a little bit on the milk stand and keeps them from choking so easily, but it also just makes those nutrients more available to their bodies. We do not feed grain to any other goats on our farm except those that are in milk. If you have a goat that's struggling to gain weight, it might be a good option to feed them some grain. But otherwise, we let the kids just be raised on milk and grass, and our bucks and wethers don't get grain either. Now, my grain ration is really heavily based on barley. Barley is such a good grain for goats. Unlike corn, barley is not super starchy, and it offers a really balanced mix of fiber, digestibility, and energy for your goats. Barley is really great for milk production, and so it is the base of any goat grain ration that I'm offering my animals. It's important when offering grain to make sure that your goats have had plenty of fiber and grass or fodder, whatever you're feeding them, in their diet before offering the grain, because they are ruminants. The grain is meant to be a very small part of their diet. It's small, but it's important, and it supports their metabolism. But first and foremost, most important is that roughage. One other thing I want to mention is that there are some really great fermented feed options out there for goats, such as alpha hay, or there used to be one called chaff hay. I don't think they're in business anymore. But in any case, they are silage or haylage fermented feeds for goats, and they're a really great option if your goats will eat them. My goats never would eat them, and we brought home so many bags and they spoiled, and my husband finally just said, please do not buy any more of these. The goats don't like it. And so I have to admit he's correct. And so we don't attempt to feed those to our goats anymore. But maybe your goats will like them, and they're a really great way to get that fermentation and probiotics into their diet on a regular basis. Now, I wanted to keep this video more focused on feed for goats, and so I'm not going to go into minerals and water and all the other important aspects of a goat's health and well-being and how you support them. But don't forget that those are really important too. You can't just focus on what to feed your goats without thinking about making sure that they have plenty of fresh water and minerals that support them, and that you have a plan for parasite prevention too. So to wrap it up, goats are browsers, not grazers. It's really great to get weeds or brambles or garden scraps or tree trimmings into their diet in addition to plenty of hay. Alfalfa is really important for dairy does. There's no such thing as a grass-fed dairy goat. Make sure you're supporting them through their lactation with a high-quality grain, and barley is a really great option for that. When in doubt, feed a little more and then back off as needed. I recommend offering hay-free choice, at least until you get a baseline for what's normal for your animals. Then you can kind of know, okay, this is how many flakes I'm feeding them each day. But generally speaking, free choice hay, don't force them to eat the stuff they don't want. Keeping a mixed herd really helps with hay waste. All right, so those are my tips and tricks for feeding your dairy goats well and supporting them in their lactation. Remember, not all goats are created equal. Dairy goats are different than pet goats, and what you feed them should be different than what you'd feed the pet goat in your backyard. This is the sort of conversation we cover in a lot more depth inside my membership, the Dairy Goat Collective. It's a great space for goat owners to learn together, support each other, and talk through the basics of holistic care for our dairy goats. Inside, I have an ever-growing library of courses and cheese-making recipes and video tutorials, a weekly private members-only podcast on a variety of goat topics, And we have guest experts on regularly too. If you're just diving into dairy goats and want to do it holistically, or would just like more community on your goat journey, we'd love to have you there. You can find out more via the link in the description. All right, friends, I'm cheering you on in your goat journey, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.